Did you notice that there were protests today?
Where at?
In Grand Rapids?
Nowhere.
It was on the corner of Fountain and Ransom Street. Well, apparently Kamala Harris came to Grand Rapids.
Oh.
Which not a lot of people knew. But she was like fighting for rights of reproductive rights and stuff like that. So she was in Fountain Street Church doing that. I was a little scared because it was nice weather, so I wanted to go on a walk outside and go take the long way around to get back to my car after school. And I wanted to go down the street, and I realized, there was like somebody setting up a microphone and doing street preaching, and there was another crowd across the intersection that was like protesting for Palestinian rights or something. I was like, whoa. I like did about 180-degree turn and went right the other way because I was like, I'm going to totally avoid this one. But
I don't know.
Culture.
Yeah, they're uneasy, but I think they're uneasy from the far left. They're the ones making it very confrontational, very dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't... yeah, because then the pro-Palestine people would be down there when she's down there. It's kind of a coincidence, isn't it? They're kind of on the same team almost, but...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, it's been a while since we've had a disruption episode. Hopefully get more episodes out. We're going to see where this one goes, but Sam's still on. He's just out for now because of church obligatory things for his church ministry that's going on. But the topic today is going to be modernism and postmodernism, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
it'd be cool to see what that entails, and yeah, I'm excited for this episode. I don't know about you, but
yeah,
really trying to be rational. But what if there's a more fundamental belief under that they actually really deep down don't want God to be real?
Right.
So they'll look for any other explanation.
It's an immoral standard to have a male changing with women. That's immoral. And if you really do care about the transgender person, you're going to tell them the truth in love. You're not going to believe their lie. You're not going to go along with their lie to make them feel better. You're going to tell them they are the gender they were born with, but you're not going to do it harshly. You're not going to make fun of them, obviously.
This is Disruption.
Where are we in the past 500 years of human history? Where are we today as opposed, or what have been the shifts that have taken place over the past 500 years? So 500 years ago, we had the Protestant Reformation, and that's the basis of Christian theism. Why America was founded on Christian values was because it was based upon a Reformation base. That took place in the 16th century. From that point on, you had the Enlightenment that came after. The Enlightenment was from the 17th to 18th century, roughly. Here's where we had deism. So deism is God created everything, but he stepped aside. Now we come in and, in a sense, start to dictate and to determine or understand the world around us now that God has been set aside or has stepped aside. And the Enlightenment brought in deism, which then led to what we're going to be talking about today, modernism, which came in the 19th century, pretty much picked up heavily after Charles Darwin's 1859 Origin of Species. So what is modernism? Modernism questions and rejects commonly held religious traditions and beliefs up to that point. So think about Darwinism. What did Darwinism teach as a worldview?
Yeah, it taught. It started off basically, I would say, very innocently, just going out the Galapagos Islands, discovering these minor changes, and then just developing a whole explanation, right? But without using God. In a way, just looking at observing science, right?
Right. So it was a naturalistic worldview that the world created itself.
Yeah.
Over millions of years, which then ended up becoming billions of years. So what was challenged was God as creator, God as sovereign Lord. Well, if humanity evolved by random processes over time, then what does this do with God? Well, God is no longer relevant or necessary. He never existed. Humanity used him as a crutch, maybe to try to make sense of things, try to create some morals and some meaning and purpose in life. But now that philosophical naturalism has come in, and this is what modernism has brought to the table. So modernism was the result of the Enlightenment that followed the Reformation. So humanity itself is believed to be at the center of the universe. So remember when deism existed or was the prominent view during the Enlightenment, God was on the outside, humanity was in the inside. God had stepped back from his creation. What modernism is saying is God doesn't exist, and he pretty much never did. So now man is at the center of the universe. Humanity is the measure of all things. Human reason triumphs over all, because there is no higher evolved species on the planet. Therefore, humanity is the one who determines what is right, what is wrong. Mix this in with scientific progress that was happening during the 19th and getting into the 20th centuries. Now humanity starts to see itself as the peak. Human reason, science, combine these two, God is set aside. So as an ideology, and you have a lot of prominent figures during this time, such as like Karl Marx, Engels, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, these kind of type of thinkers, who then their ideas ended up becoming mainstream in the textbooks of our universities. And we start to see a cultural shift when their ideas are being taught in the universities as the Judeo-Christian values are being taken out.
It's interesting because I'm seeing now that there is a real push for people to just live away from trying to make sense of reality without God being a factor.
Right.
And I used to kind of think when I was younger, I used to have this kind of distrust. Well, how do I know that what my parents are saying is actually true? You know, how is it that I end up in the most like the true religion of all the other beliefs that are happening in the world?
Right.
And I thought, well, I guess it kind of makes sense that an atheist would be an atheist, because they would just be thinking they would be a real true skeptic, right? They would be struggling to figure out, okay, I can't just believe in the Bible because the Bible says it's true. That's circular reasoning. Why would I believe that? So I used to think that, atheists were really trying to be rational. But what if there's a more fundamental belief under that they actually really deep down don't want God to be real?
Right.
So they'll look for any other explanation that he doesn't exist, you know? And then that really turns the table on its head, because I'm like, now it really starts to make sense. The Bible really is true. But they're just in complete denial. It doesn't matter how much evidence you have for it. As long as you can, Freud says this. Well, Freud was a sexist, like corrupt, even secular people would admit that today.
Right. So what makes Freud the foundation? So what I mean is, okay, so you're taking God out and the Bible out and you're replacing him with Freud or Marx. Why? What's your basis? What's your rationale for that? Not you personally, but somebody who is drifting away or going in a different direction. What is the reason why you are adopting an atheistic worldview? Is it really rational? See, during from 18 to 22, people leave home. They're developing their new identity. They're kind of setting aside what their parents have told them. They're going to see the world for themselves. And what better way to do that than as an atheist? Because then there is no overarching standard or no overarching grid or pattern you have to follow. You can go and make up whatever rules you want to make up. So doing that as an atheist then can give you a clear conscience. Morality, in a sense, is just relative or subjective to your parents' home or whatever environment you want to surround yourself in. So now morals are no longer objective, they're relative, and you can go and live the lifestyle that you want.
See, because that was the other misconception I had too, was like, okay, so if you were to stand above the Bible, doesn't it seem rational to stand above the Bible and do try to prove its existence and try to explain away, try to explain its truth and rationality? But then I came to this conclusion that wait, but that would be a human. You're trying to put when you try to put the Bible under a microscope, in a sense of like, that's kind of what modernism is trying to do. We're putting the Bible under a microscope and analyzing it. It's a form of humanity above God, and we don't have this God speaking down to humanity. Because if humans want to analyze what is true, well, you do the scientific experiments, or you try to use human reasoning. And you see kind of what I mean?
Yeah.
When you do
So what you want to think about is, okay, so if an atheist is proposing human reason as the foundation, well, then the question is what is reason?
Yeah.
What is reason?
How do you define that?
Where does it come from? Why do we have that ability? How do we know we're reasonable? What do we base our reason upon? So I don't know if you got something you got to do here. Or?
I was trying to get to this one thing that I watched.
Okay.
Actually, but I have to sort through, and it's basically this book that's trying to talk about, I don't know, it was some form of like, let's try to talk about relationships without God and just use science. And there was like a line in there that I was like, oh, this might be relating to this, but maybe it can't. But I just can't find it. Oh, attached. There it is. It's called Attached. The New Science of Adult Attachment and How It Can Help You Find and Keep Love. And this description I found was the first line of this summary of this book is, we already rely on science to teach us what to eat, when to exercise, and how long to sleep. Why not use science to help us improve our relationships? In this revolutionary book, psychiatrist and neuroscientist Dr. Amir Levine and Rachel Heller scientifically explain why some people seem to navigate relationships effortlessly while others struggle. And I just found that, and I was like, whoa, isn't that a profound statement behind everything that we're trying to do in worldview today?
Well, what they're trying to do is make science no matter what it is, it's science.
Yeah.
So how do you bring science into metaphysics? How do you bring science into faith and history?
Yeah.
So something that's not empirically verifiable in front of you at the moment, if it's not that, then how can it be science? So they're trying to take the word science, and what they're trying to do is, with science, what hides behind that is humanistic presuppositions. So if I say the word science, that means God is out. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to take faith and reason and separate it, or God and science and separate it, and saying, if you want facts, you go to science. If you want faith, you go to religion. Mm-hmm. If you want facts, you go to humanism. If you want superstition, you go to religion. So they're trying to break the two apart and trying to say everything is scientific. But metaphysics, first-person subjective experience, history, those things can't be put under a microscope. So they're trying to take the banner of science and wrap it around all human experience, which it can't do, but they're still trying to do that. By no matter what you say, they're trying to make it scientific, and they can't.
Yeah.
Because science rests on metaphysics.
Yeah. It's kind of like what my friend and I call my best friend once a week, and we just talk about the most random things. But he's going through his psychology class, as well as I am, and we both kind of came to the same conclusion that every time we're talking about it in terms of just this no God perspective point of view, just the terms and definitions and the facts and the data, it almost kind of seems creepy, like some of the experiments they did in psychology, because it almost is like they're trying to quantify a human being. But it's like you can't do that. Right. It takes the humanity. It almost like dehumanizes us. Turns us into robots. But then you have to ask the question, this psychology, if that comes from the Greek word, psyche or soul, psyche. Well, if you are an atheist or if you believe in evolution, everything is matter, it's material. Right. So then how do human beings have a soul or something to study, a mind, if all we are is matter? So psychology is the study of the human soul. But if all we are is matter, we don't have souls. Yeah. So how do you account for that? A materialist trying to talk about the human soul. Yeah. You've already eliminated the human soul if everything is material. Yeah. So now all we are is what our brains do. Mm-hmm.
So how do you study what the brain does? If it's just electrochemical reactions going on in the brain, how do you study that scientifically? How do you get that under a microscope? Even if we are nothing but what our brains do, each person's action and reaction is determined, or it's behavioristic based upon their culture. If you believe that human beings have a blank slate for a mind and everything that we know is just our experience and we're just reacting to what filled in that blank piece of paper on our mind, or if it's the chemicals in our brain that are causing us to do what we do, why study psychology? Because all we are is just reacting to what's going on in here if there's no person or mind behind that. Mm-hmm. But now if you're going to study psychology and believe that you have a mind, how do you account for the mind?
Yeah.
If everything is matter, how do you account for an immaterial mind?
I should throw that question at my professor at some point.
And then if we have an immaterial mind, how do you account for the immaterial mind working with the material brain, that interaction?
Yeah.
How do you account for that?
Just don't think too hard.
Well, these are all these questions that if they're going to stand and say this is the way life is, or this is fact, well, then answer these questions. And if you can't answer these questions that we just proposed, this is what happens when you take God or the immaterial or the supernatural out. Mm-hmm. And replace it with humanistic theory, making everything matter. Well, then how do you account for so many other things?
Yeah.
So now switching the gears, that was modernism. So think of modernism as, if you remember the account of the Titanic, bigger, faster, stronger, unsinkable. That was kind of the mindset behind modernism. Science is the solution to all things. Then what ended up happening is there was a shift from modernism to postmodernism. So what ended up happening is people started to realize, World War I, World War II, all of these promises that modernism brought to the table were unfulfilled. Science can't answer all things. Humanity by themselves are an insufficient reference point. So there's all of these flaws that humanity brings in from generation to generation, and war is one of them. So if science and human reason is the foundation for all things, and that's going to bring in utopia, the 20th century was evidence that that's definitely not the case, and people started to realize this. So what ended up happening is people started to become cynical. Everything is not measurable in a test tube. Humanity is not the solution. Human reason cannot answer all of the world's problems. So there was a shift that took place in people's thinking regarding this, that you can't know anything for sure. Modernism thought you could, or at least we're going to get there. And modernism's still very relevant today. If you think of the new atheists, those are very modernist type people where we don't know the solution yet, but we're working on it. But with postmodernism doubts everything. Postmodernism will say you can't know anything for sure. Postmodernism will get rid of all objective standards and say that what is true for you is not necessarily true for me, meaning there's no objective standard that everybody has to adhere to. It doesn't exist. So now what we find happening within postmodernism is you have these little micro, rather than having a macro narrative, you have a micro narrative now where it's just this small group over here, this small group over there, they have their truth, the person over here has their truth. Nihilism rules the day, meaning everything is relative. There are no objective standards. So if there isn't a standard by which everybody is to follow, nobody can impose their view on anybody else.
So would you say then that modernism is like, we don't have the answer yet, but we've got some of the answer, it's developing, we're still working on it. And then postmodernism is just like, we just give up, there isn't an answer, there's no answer. Everybody is, well, maybe we do have the answers, but everybody else is different, right?
Well, there is no ultimate answer in postmodernism. And to say that, a postmodern will say that's being arrogant. And yes, modernism is kind of like if you ever stared into a pinwheel, that spinning circular thing. It's almost hypnotic. And what modernism does is it takes a look at modern inventions and technology, and it gets hypnotized by its own ability to create something. So the scientist becomes overinflated with what they're able to do, and they promote it and sell it to the public, and the public becomes that way as well. iPads, computers, AI, all of these things, vaccines, medical breakthroughs. You name it, all of the technology that each generation experiences it's a strong indicator, and it influences humans' trust and if a scientist says it, it's true. If the doctor says it, well, who's going to argue with the doctor? So humanity gets put on a pedestal with science, thinking that they can still someday find the solution to all the problems. Postmodernism is very skeptical of that. They're going to say, yeah, science has brought us to a point, but we're really no better off as a human race with the science than without it. Actually, what ended up happening is the science has caused more and more death if you look at war, violence, famine, political oppression, those kinds of things. So they're looking at it from the different side. So postmodernism is very sarcastic and cynical. Postmodernism abandons a meta-narrative. So you see with Christianity, we have the God of the Bible, creation, fall, redemption, glory. We have a meta-narrative to the whole existence of the human race, Jesus Christ being the center point on the cross, redeeming us from our sin. Now, if you take a look at postmodernism, you don't have that. You are just here today, you create your own existence, you go by what you want to do. Everybody kind of lives their own life, defining who they are. Existence preceding essence, so to speak, from existentialism. That kind of belief.
Well, you said that Christianity has an answer because it has a complete sort of meta-narrative, right?
Well, Christianity has a meta-narrative from God's perspective, yeah.
Oh, it has a meta-narrative?
It is a meta-narrative. The whole thing is creation, fall, redemption, glory is the meta-narrative of the human race.
Okay, so when you look at suffering, maybe this is getting a little bit off topic, but if you look at suffering and how that plays into every other worldview, with atheism, suffering is meaningless, right? Because if we're all just an accident, then suffering is just, well, there's suffering because there isn't a good God who is all-powerful, who's going to prevent it. And so that's why we have suffering, but we're really all just an accident. So our lives are here, that's meaningless. Or when it comes to postmodernism, suffering isn't necessarily real, maybe. But when it plays into Christianity, it's still confusing because we have a good God who is all-powerful and yet still allows suffering, which almost makes it more confusing. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, there's quite a bit you said there. So atheists and postmodernists believe in evil, and they believe in suffering. They believe in injustice, and that injustices have to be corrected. So if you believe in injustices, you have to believe in justice. So you have to believe both good and evil. So they believe that good and evil exist, you just don't have an account for why it exists in postmodernism and in atheism.
That makes sense.
So in Christianity, we do. Morality is based upon God's character.
Yeah.
So we have a foundation, God himself. When an atheist cries injustice, you have to ask them on what basis? Your opinion? Society? A group over here? The experts? What is the foundation for morality? Mm-hmm. And they'll say, just common sense. Okay, so what's the basis for common sense? Please tell me what the foundation is for morality, and then we'll go from there. So when you take God away, everything becomes relative at that point. Postmodernism, who says there is no meta-narrative and there is no objective standard, but yet turns around and say there's injustice in the world and we have to rid the world of injustice, is contradicting themselves.
Yeah. Because
if there is no objective standard, then there is no injustice. There just is. Mm-hmm. So do you see how the law of God is written on everybody's heart? And the atheist, the modernist, and the postmodernist cannot break away from that.
Yeah.
We can't break away from who we've been created in God.
So the modernist is like an empty shell. The postmodernist is contradicting itself. Mm-hmm. But then the Christian has a basis for it.
Right.
Interesting.
We have the basis for it. Now they're going to ask, then why does an all-loving, all-powerful God allow suffering to take place? Either he's not all-loving, all-powerful, or he doesn't exist, or he is evil himself. That's kind of the solution that the atheist or the postmodernist will bring to the table for the Christian. And the answer from the Christian perspective is God doesn't tell us why, but he tells us to trust in him, and he has offered himself, the second person, Christ, has offered himself on the cross. For one day, this will all come to an end. So the solution is the cross.
Right.
Evil will come to an end someday.
Yeah.
The world will be judged. Justice will come. Jesus has guaranteed that, and he has spilt his own blood for that. But until that point, God has a morally good and justifiable reason as to why everything is taking place the way it is. We don't have that perspective. And since we don't have that perspective, we have to take it by faith. So we have a sufficient answer, but we don't have an exhaustive answer because God hasn't told us why. So just continuing with postmodernism, because it's important that we stay, I think, on this one, because this is kind of what you're going to see in modern universities today. So what we're seeing here is it's a blueprint for deconstructing the Christian worldview, postmodernism. They claim morality is relative and that there's no such thing as an absolute standard, but they only claim this when their worldview is being challenged. So for instance, if you say, this type of practice is wrong, well, who are you to tell me that? That's right for me and it's not right for you. Okay? So now let's say the Christian baker, for example, refuses to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. They're going to be the first one to jump on that Christian baker. Or if you don't acknowledge pronouns, they're going to be the first one to jump on you for not acknowledging the pronoun. So they're inconsistent. When you're telling them that something is immoral, they're going to say all morality is relative. But when you break or cross their threshold, they're going to hit you with everything they have for breaking their moral standards. So they go from being non-objective and nihilistic to being authoritative once you cross their line. So they have a duality here where they define morality as relative or subjective. But then when they're on the offensive, they're totalitarian. So they're inconsistent. They're playing both sides. So we have to call that, see that for what it is. Once you see inconsistency, you know you have a failed argument, because if something contradicts itself, it's obviously false.
Yeah. Wow. I see this as an example of this in my own life. My girlfriend was having this conversation with this music professor, and this is very recent. But the music professor basically said, they were having a conversation about transgender rights, and the professor believed that, transgender people, like for instance, if you have a man who is transgender and becomes a woman, runs in a woman's race and he wins, then but that's okay. Like they can have these rights because, I guess, to someone maybe that doesn't believe in God, or even if they do believe in God, but it's sort of a liberation theology God, which is a different topic. It almost kind of seems like this. So when you try to understand this professor that we're talking with, that he wants to empathize both with like the transgender people who have rights, but also the people who are very uncomfortable, especially like a woman who's uncomfortable with a transgender man in the woman's bathroom, in the locker room for their sports finals or whatever. That would be uncomfortable, right? So whose rights are you infringing on? You've got to infringe on somebody's rights. Right. You can't get away with that. You can't just like empathize with both teams. No.
Yeah, one has to be right or they're both wrong. So what ends up happening is the transgender rights are, which is what, one out of how many people, especially in sports, very small fractional percentage, end up trumping the rights of the majority by far. And now you have a biological male in a locker room or changing room or whatever it is with females. So here's the thing, and this is where postmodernism is very successful, at pitying other people and making somebody the oppressed. Making somebody feel like they are being bullied and they have been outcasted, and then that brings in human sympathy, and so humans feel guilty. So then what do? It's emotional response now. So the transgender who is being shunned or being rejected or being mocked or being made fun of, it's inherent in human nature to come alongside that person and lift them up, even if it's above the majority. So now the majority is now subjected to the oppressed. So this is what cultural Marxism does. It takes the oppressed and it lifts them. Now they become the oppressor and oppress those who they claim were oppressing them. But the standard is not right. It's an immoral standard to have a male changing with women. That's immoral. And if you really do care about the transgender person, you're going to tell them the truth in love. You're not going to believe their lie. You're not going to go along with their lie to make them feel better. You're going to tell them they are the gender they were born with, but you're not going to do it harshly. You're not going to make fun of them, obviously. You're going to come alongside them and get them the proper help that they need to see reality clearly. So who's seeing reality clearly here? Is it the transgender, or is it the person who understands that you are the gender that you're born with? So what postmodernism does is it creates its own metaphysical reality. It changes the rules of the game. So they take a fraction of a percent of a population, by far the minority, and they use that person to change the rules of how the entire game is played. Now the 99% of the population has to follow the rules that the 1% has just created. So the oppressed become the oppressor, cultural Marxism. So there's inconsistencies that abound here with postmodernism. So they say, for instance, that there is no objective standard. So, I mean, we don't have time to go into all of these. But reality, so if we pick up a book, you can never know what the author's true intentions were of the book, because he wrote that from his own first-person subjective experience. So we have no way of reading that book, picking it up, and understanding what he said. So the correct way to interpret a book now is what we take from the book, how we interpret the book. Not what the author has stated, but what we think it says. That's prominent today in most hermeneutics in understanding postmodern. It's called deconstruction. The philosopher Derrida is the one who pretty much did this with all literature. So books now are interpreted by the reader, not trying to understand what the author has stated. So this is how they can pick up the Bible and create any interpretation that they want for themselves or for a small group or for a group of people. There is no objective message coming out of the Bible. There is no objective message coming out of any book. Everything has now been relativized to the reader, the person reading the book.
Did Derrida write any books?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. And there's the inconsistency, because Derrida had to write a book on how everything is subjective when you read. But the postmodernist who picks up his book has to think he's speaking objectively and truthfully, and they have to take him for what he says. So it's an absolute glaring contradiction that the postmodern author who says all reading is subjective is assuming that everybody's going to take him objectively.
Right. Yeah, that's so strange. I wonder how that actually how do they not see that? I'm sure postmodern professors have to see that contradiction. How do they respond to that? So I don't know. I think there's they're either taken in by it and they believe this, or B, this is what I think. In order to bring about a revolution, you have to scramble the mindset and to bring anarchy. And this is what's happening. A man, what is a woman? Nobody can answer that today. Why? Because we have taken away any firm foundation of defining what a man or a woman is. Now everything becomes subjective and relative. Now you have no standard or basis to stand on. Now you have anarchy. Everybody is creating their own reality for themselves, and everybody's fighting with themselves, and there is no objective standard for all. There is no objective moral standard for all, because now we have everybody individualized and fighting everybody else. And when anarchy comes, now there is no strength anymore. The numbers have been decimated, divide and conquer. So now everybody's against everybody else, and it's easy now for a regime to come in and to take over a people that are in utter chaos. So if you want to take over a nation, take away their religion, take away their objective standards, confuse them on gender identity, bring in drugs, bring in all of these vices, pornography. You don't have to conquer them militarily. If you give them vices, they will self-destruct on their own. Kind of like when you put out rat poison. The rat comes and grabs a whole bunch and brings it back to the babies. Well, they've just taken all of that poison out, and then the whole family eats that poison. The family of rats die. So if we keep this immorality going, this gender confusion, this the devastating effects of pornography and drugs and alcohol and all of these other things, if children are being raised in
these radical left ideologies that our teachers and then our universities are imposing on them, it's not long before the generation becomes unstable. And we're seeing that today.
You know, it's interesting because I learned in my high school Bible class with Mr. Shank, who we had on here a couple times, but I want to have him on again at some point. But he was describing to us about Nietzsche, talking about God is dead, and now what are we going to do? Because society is just going to break down. Because there was at one point a foundation that all of Western society was built on, and we could all be safe because we were all structured and anchored down to this one point. And now we took away the anchor, so now we're all going to be split up. And I think it was very prophetic what he said there, because what do you have in the very next century after Nietzsche? You have the 1900s, so like all these wars and stuff, which I think you might have covered this before, but we might have talked about this, but you know, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War. You know, you almost have the 1,000-year war coming back again with, you know, the Christianized country versus the Muslims, and how that starting again in the 90s. The Cold War with the Soviets and all this stuff. It's just a very, now that we've taken away the anchor, everyone's unstable and we're all being divided. And the protests on the streets, like the one I encountered this afternoon, you know, it's just a very unstable place that we find ourselves in.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what ends up happening when you reject God and reject who we are. And it's pretty interesting how humanity just wants to do everything it can to distance itself from the reality that we're created in God's image for the purpose of worshiping and living according to his standards.
Yeah.
We do everything we can. We evolved. We've been seeded here by aliens. We're a cosmic accident. We're not the gender that we're born with. We live autonomously, that there is no moral code that I have to follow. Just as long as I'm not hurting somebody else, I'm allowed to live however I want to live. We do everything we can to distance ourselves from the fact that we are created in God's image and that we have his image, the Imago Dei, implanted within us. We have his moral law written on our hearts, and even when we try to say there is no such thing as objective morality, the first thing the postmodern does is turn around and cries injustice. So they contradict themselves. We can't escape the fact that we're created in God's image, no matter how hard we try. And I think that's what we've seen in the 20th and now in the 21st century. So since we have abandoned God, now what? So there's a quote going around saying once, I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, once man abandons God, anything is possible. Because now there's no limits, there's no standards. Mm-hmm. So as morality declines, we just keep seeing what we see. But that's the danger. So we've seen this modern/postmodern shift from atheism coming out of deism, and from deism coming out of the Reformation and Christian theism. We want to get back, not to the 1500s, we want to be in the year we're in today, but with the same biblical worldview that was back during the Reformation and prior, all the way back to the first century church, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. We want to get back to the way God has designed us and created us to live. Everything else after that becomes an ideology, somebody's interpretation, somebody's belief that this is how life is supposed to be lived. And as they gather their facts and bring about their ideology, they have designed it to come to a certain conclusion. So what we're doing is we're looking to the experts to take God's creation and to reinterpret it through human reason and how to bring about utopia. And that's never going to happen, because if God is even at a deistic level, much worse an atheistic level, the only foundation for us to build on has been set aside. We're never going to achieve utopia outside of Christian worldview, because this is how we're created, this is how we've been designed, and this is how the Lord has prescribed for us to live. And the more we get away from that, the more we unravel. We dehumanize ourselves.
Do you think we can find absolute, okay, so like the postmodernist says, okay, you make a mistake in or humans make mistakes, right? We all make mistakes in our interpretation, our reasoning. And then they go further and say, well, we also have our own presuppositions, our own truths, if you will. So now we all can't come to the same truth accurately. So now there's just no absolute truth. But do you think there's absolute truth? And can we find it, even though we are constantly making mistakes, constantly going off certain paths? You know what I'm saying?
No, say that again.
We may not have absolute truth now, today, because we don't have all the answers, but we can find adequate truth. Like, we can find enough.
Well, if we're looking at what 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 tells us, the Word of God is inspired, and it's sufficient. It's not exhaustive, it's sufficient. So we have sufficient truth within Scripture to live how God wants us to live. Doesn't mean we have exhaustive truth, doesn't mean we know everything, but what we know is sufficient for a lifestyle of godliness. So we're not claiming we have exhaustive knowledge. God does, we don't, but we have sufficient knowledge that God has given us.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on board. That's where you find truth. When we're sitting in this world full of, now we got all these different beliefs coming on, and everyone's trying to figure out, okay, where is this objective truth? Where is the standard? Where is something that we can all anchor ourselves into? It is in, God's Word where we can find this. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to the Disruption Podcast, where we disrupt the culture and place Jesus at the center of it all. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing from wherever you are. You can also follow us on Instagram. Once again, thank you so much. We'll see you on the next episode.